My name is Liam Henderson. Before this summer, I was a 20-year-old urbanite, a student of computational sciences at the University of Regina, and a firm believer in logic, reason, and the reassuring predictability of code. My world was one of defined parameters and solvable problems. The supernatural was a genre of fiction, not a variable in the equation of my life, but tuition fees are a harsh reality, and my part-time job at a campus coffee shop wasn't going to cut it. That's how I found myself scrolling through the provincial youth employment and skills program website, looking for something, anything, that paid well. The advertisement stood out. Summer farm hand required for family-owned grain farm. Remote location. Hard work essential. Room and board provided. Excellent compensation. The listed pay was more than excellent, it was suspicious. It was double what any other manual labor job was offering. The farm was located in the rural municipality of Stonehenge No. 73. A name that sounded more like a historical landmark than a place people actually lived. Against my better judgment, driven by the looming deadline for my tuition payment, I applied. 2 days later, I received a short, typewritten email from a Mr. Silas Gable. It said, "You are suitable. Arrive on the 1st of June. Directions are attached." There was no interview, no phone call. That should have been my second warning. I ignored it. The drive out was a lesson in the deceptive nature of the prairies. At first, it was beautiful. Saskatchewan is called the land of living skies for a reason. The sky was an immense, impossibly blue dome, punctuated by towering white clouds that looked solid enough to walk on. Golden fields of canola and young wheat stretched out on either side of the highway, an endless carpet of vibrant life. But as I turned off the main highway and onto a series of smaller gravel roads, the beauty began to feel oppressive. The landscape flattened into a perfect, featureless plain. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a giant, unblinking eye. There were no hills, no significant landmarks, just the straight line of the road cutting through the immense, silent fields. An hour into the back roads, my phone lost its signal. The comforting blue dot of my GPS vanished, leaving me with only Silas Gable's printed, slightly archaic directions. The isolation was no longer a concept, it was a physical presence, a weight in the air. This wasn't just being out of the city, this was being removed from the world. Finally, after a drive that felt like it had taken days, I saw it. A cluster of buildings rising from the plains like a forgotten island in a sea of grass. The Gable Farm. The main farmhouse was a 2-story structure that looked like it had been ordered from an Eaton's catalog a century ago. A classic mill-cut house designed for prairie settlers. It had a low, pitched roof and a wide, wraparound porch, though the porch sagged on one corner as if tired of holding itself up. Beside the main staircase, I could see the dull colors of a stained glass window, a strange touch of elegance in the otherwise starkly practical setting. A large, weathered barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings and, most noticeably, a stone-lined root cellar with a heavy wooden door set into a small mound of earth. As I pulled my car to a stop, the front door of the house opened. A man and a woman stepped out onto the porch. They had to be Elspeth and Silas Gable. They were both in their late 60s, gaunt and weathered as the land itself. Silas was tall and thin, with a face full of deep lines. Elspeth was smaller, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes watchful and still. They didn't smile or wave. They just stood there, waiting, their silence more unnerving than any shouted greeting could have been. "Liam Henderson," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was dry, like rustling leaves. Yes, sir. Mr. Gable, I said, trying to sound cheerful. The work is hard, Elspeth said, her voice a low murmur. You'll earn your keep. They showed me to my room on the second floor. It was small, clean, and sparse, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the endless fields. After I'd dropped my bag, Silas led me back downstairs to the kitchen. He handed me a single sheet of laminated paper. The text was typewritten, the letters slightly uneven. The rules, he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. You follow them. You don't ask why. You just do. This is how you stay safe here. I took the sheet and read it. My initial thought was that they were just overly cautious, perhaps a bit eccentric, the way people who live in isolation can be. But as I read further, a cold knot of unease began to form in my stomach. These weren't just safety guidelines. Something was deeply wrong with them. 1. Your workday begins at sunrise and ends at sunset. Do not be outside the farmhouse between these times. No exceptions. 2. The barn door must be latched from the outside at all times. Even if you are inside, use the inner bolt only in an emergency. 3. All tools must be cleaned and returned to the workshop before dusk. Do not leave tools in the fields overnight. They will not be there in the morning. 4. You will be provided with 3 meals a day. Eat what is given to you. Do not bring your own food onto the property. 5. The well water is for the land and the livestock only. Your drinking water is from the cistern. Do not confuse them. 6. If you see something in the fields that looks out of place, a shape, a color, a movement, do not approach it. Look away and continue your work. It is not for you. 7. Do not harm the crows. They are watching, but they are not the ones you should fear. 8. When you hear the whistling at night, stay in your room. Do not look out the window. It is only the wind. I looked up from the list, a dozen questions on my lips. What happens if I'm outside after sunset? What's in the barn that needs to be latched in? What will take the tools? But the look on Silas's face, a flat, impassive wall, stopped me. The rules weren't a negotiation. They were the terms of my employment, and perhaps my survival. The Gables weren't just strange. They were acting like keepers of a fragile truce I couldn't comprehend. My summer job, the one I took to pay for my classes in logic and reason, had just introduced a new set of parameters. They were illogical, unsettling, and terrifyingly absolute. The whistling at night, that was the one that truly got under my skin. I had heard the wind on the prairies my whole life. It howls, it screams, it moans, but it doesn't whistle. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed in the silent house, I tried to rationalize it all. The Gables were just superstitious country folk. The rules were their way of dealing with the profound loneliness of this place. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into an ocean of darkness that seemed to press against the window panes, I felt a genuine, primal fear. I was miles from anyone, without a phone signal, in a house with 2 strangers and a list of rules that felt less like precautions and more like the commandments of some forgotten, malevolent god. And I had a sinking feeling that I was about to find out why each one of them existed. The first week was a blur of grueling, monotonous labor that seemed designed to grind down my body and spirit. My days were governed by the sun, just as Rule 1 dictated. From the moment the first sliver of light appeared on the eastern horizon until the last ember of sunset faded in the west, I was in the fields. I mended what felt like 100 miles of barbed wire fence. I walked the endless rows of lentil and chickpea crops, clearing rocks from the soil, my back aching and my hands raw. The work was relentless, the sun was merciless, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the wind and the cawing of the ever-present crows. The crows were unnerving. They sat on the fence posts and the roof of the barn, their black eyes following my every move. I remembered Rule 79. Do not harm the crows. They are watching, but they are not the ones you should fear. It was the second part of that rule that haunted me. If the crows weren't the ones to fear, who was? I began to feel the weight of Rule 6. The sheer scale of the prairie landscape played tricks on the eyes. At the periphery of my vision, where the vibrant yellow of a canola field met the endless blue of the sky, I would catch flickers of movement. A ripple in the sea of yellow when there was no wind. A shape too tall and thin to be a deer that would vanish the moment I turned to look at it directly. Each time, I would force myself to look away, my heart pounding, and repeat the words in my head, "It is not for you." The first real test of the rules came a week into my stay. A small, dusty-looking border collie, clearly a stray, wandered onto the property. Its tongue lolling out in the heat, it trotted towards me, tail giving a hopeful wag. I'm a dog person. My first instinct was to kneel, to offer it some water from my canteen. I was about to call out to it when the screen door of the farmhouse slammed open. Elspeth stood on the porch, her face a mask of pure, undiluted terror. "Inside!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a panic I hadn't thought her capable of. "Get in the workshop. Now." Her fear was so absolute, so contagious, that I didn't question it. I scrambled into the nearby workshop and slid the heavy wooden door shut. A moment later, I heard a single, sharp yelp from outside, cut off with sickening finality. Then, silence. I stayed in the dark, musty workshop for what felt like an hour, my hands shaking. When I finally emerged, the dog was gone. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. But I saw Silas walking back from the spot where the dog had been, carrying an empty bucket. He had been to the well. He had used the well water, the water that Rule 5 said was only for the land and the livestock, to wash the spot clean. It wasn't just water. It was for cleansing, for erasing. My attempts to rationalize the Gable's behavior crumbled. This was not superstition. This was real. My isolation felt more profound than ever. I checked my phone a dozen times a day, hoping for a single bar of service, but there was nothing. One evening, I tried the old rotary phone in the hallway, only to be met with a dead, hollow silence. When I asked Elspeth about it, she just stared at me with those flat, gray eyes and said, "We have no one to call." The statement was so simple, so final, it chilled me to the bone. A few days later, I made my first mistake. Exhausted after a 14-hour day, I left a heavy wrench lying in the field by a fence post I'd been repairing. I didn't realize it until I was lying in bed that night. I violated Rule 3. I thought about sneaking out to get it, but the memory of Elspeth's scream and the dog's yelp kept me frozen in my room. The next morning, I went to the spot. The wrench was gone. In its place, sitting perfectly on top of the fence post, was a small, crude doll made of twisted twigs and dried grass. It was bound together with something I recognized with a jolt of horror, the black and white lace from one of my own running shoes. The message was clear. The threat was no longer general, it was personal. Whatever was out there knew who I was. When I returned to the house, pale and shaken, Elspeth was waiting for me in the kitchen. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew. She simply placed another laminated sheet on the table. "You've been careless," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The rules have changed. You need to be more careful." I picked up the new list. The original 8 rules were still there, but 4 new ones had been added at the bottom. Reading them, I felt the last of my rational world slip away. 9. If you find an object that is not yours, do not touch it. Announce, "This is not mine to take," and walk away without looking back. 10. The root cellar door is to remain bolted. The preserves inside are not for eating. They are an offering. 11. Do not wear anything shiny. No watches, no belt buckles, no polished boots. It draws their attention. 12. If you cut yourself, you must bleed on the soil. Do not wipe the blood away. The land is owed its share. I stared at the list, my mind reeling. Rule 11 felt like something out of ancient folklore, a warning about attracting fairies or spirits who covet shiny things. Rule 12 was even worse. The land is owed its share. It framed the farm not as a place of business, but of sacrifice. And Rule 10, the one about the root cellar, sparked a new, terrible curiosity. What preserves required such a stark warning? My presence here had upset some delicate balance. The Gables weren't just my employers, they were wardens, struggling to manage a pact with an unseen, territorial power. I was the new, unpredictable element, a liability they were trying to control with new, more explicit instructions. The horror wasn't just that the rules were real, but that they were dynamic. They could change. And with each change, the cage around me grew smaller, and the nature of the thing I was being protected from, or perhaps being prepared for, grew terrifyingly clearer. I was no longer just working on a farm. I was navigating a minefield of ancient rituals, and I had just learned that stepping on a mine doesn't just kill you. It rewrites the map for everyone. Fear is a powerful motivator. For 2 weeks, it had kept me obedient, forcing me to follow the Gables' bizarre rules to the letter. But now, a different kind of fear was taking over, the terror of ignorance. I couldn't survive this place if I didn't understand it. My rational mind, the part of me that had been suppressed by the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of the farm, screamed for data. I needed to know the why, and I had a strong suspicion that the answers were in the one place I was explicitly forbidden to go, the root cellar. Rule 10 was absolute. The root cellar door is to remain bolted. The preserves inside are not for eating. They are an offering. That night, I waited until the old house was steeped in the profound silence of the prairie midnight. The Gables slept in a room on the ground floor. Their breathing was a faint, rhythmic whisper. Armed with a flashlight, I crept out of the house and across the yard. The damp grass cooled beneath my bare feet. The cellar door was secured by a heavy iron bolt, just as the rule implied. It was stiff with rust, but with a painful, groaning screech, it slid back. The air that wafted up from the darkness was thick and cloying, a smell of damp earth, rot, and something else, something metallic and sweet. I descended the stone steps, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. The cellar was exactly as one might expect from a century. Old farmhouses, stone, lined walls, a packed dirt floor, and rough wooden shelves lining the perimeter. But the shelves were filled with hundreds of mason jars, each one coated in a thick layer of dust. My light fell upon the contents of the nearest jar. It wasn't peaches or beans. It was a dark, viscous liquid, almost black, with murky shapes suspended within it. I moved the light along the shelves. Some jars contained what looked like bundles of hair, others held yellowed teeth, and one, to my horror, contained a small, curled braid of blonde hair, tied with a faded blue ribbon. These were the preserves. These were the offerings. Frantic now, I began searching the cellar. In the far corner, one of the large flagstones that made up the floor seemed slightly loose. I pried it up with my fingers, my nails filling with damp soil. Beneath it was a small, hollow space, and nestled inside was a rusted tin box. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the answer. I took the box back to my room, my hands trembling so badly I could barely work the latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound diary. The ink on the first page was faded but legible. The property of Annalise Gable, 1934. I began to read, and the history of the farm's curse spooled out before me. Annalise was a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, and her words painted a grim picture of life during the Dust Bowl. She wrote of endless drought, of crops turning to dust in the fields, of the constant fear of starvation. She mentioned the local Cree, who had lived on this land for generations, and their stories of the Kwa, Si, Sak, the little people, spirits of the land who demanded respect. But her father, a desperate man pushed to the brink, had sought more than respect. He had sought a bargain. Annalise described a ritual her father performed in the dead of winter, a pact made with what he called the silent folk, the ones who live below the roots. He offered his own blood to the frozen earth and begged for life. And the land answered. The next spring, their fields were green while their neighbors remained barren. The farm flourished, an oasis of impossible bounty in a decade of desolation. But the pact had a price. The diary detailed the emergence of the rules, almost identical to the ones I had been given. The land required payment for its gifts. It demanded offerings, a share of every living thing on the farm. The preserves in the cellar were the tithe, a lock of hair from a newborn calf, a tooth from a pig, a jar of blood from the slaughter. It was a ledger of sacrifice. The diary chronicled years of this grim accounting, the family trapped in their prosperous prison. Then I reached the final entry. The handwriting was shaky, terrified. October 12, 1937. The harvest is early this year, the best we have ever seen. Father says the land is pleased, but it is hungry for more than the usual tithe. He says for such a gift, it requires a new seed to be planted, one to tend the soil from below. This morning at breakfast, he looked at me, and his eyes were full of tears. He said my name. The diary ended there. I dropped the book as if it were burning. The summer job, the excellent pay, the isolation, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. I wasn't an employee. I was the next offering. The new seed. A floorboard creaked in the corner of my room. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I slowly raised my flashlight. A shape was coalescing in the shadows by the door. It wasn't Silas or Elspeth. It was rising from the floor itself, a figure woven from the very elements of the prairie. Its body was a twisting mass of dark soil, dry roots, and brittle grass. Its arms were gnarled branches, and its head was a great, dried sunflower, the dark, empty seed, holes forming a vacant, terrifying face. It was the land itself, given monstrous form. It took a slow, deliberate step towards me, the floorboards groaning under its impossible weight. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It raised an arm made of woven roots and pointed not at me, but at the open diary on my bed. Then its gaze shifted towards the window, out at the dark, waiting fields. The message was unspoken but perfectly clear. The story was true. The debt was due. With a sound like the sighing of wind, through dead grass, the creature dissolved, crumbling back into dust and shadows, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of rich earth and decay. I scrambled out of my bed and fled my room, not thinking, just running. I now knew the truth. The Gables weren't protecting me from the entity. They were fattening the calf for slaughter. They were my captors, and the harvest was coming. The next morning, the air was different. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a low, mechanical roar that vibrated through the very foundations of the farmhouse. It was the sound of the combine harvester, a monstrous machine of red paint and gleaming steel blades, which Silas was steering in vast, sweeping lines across the wheat field. The harvest had begun. For me, it was the sound of a ticking clock, each pass of the combine a second closer to my own end. There was no more pretense. When I came down to the kitchen, Silas was there, his hands clean, but his eyes ancient with a terrible, wary knowledge. Elspeth stood by the stove, her back to me. "You were in the cellar," Silas said. It was a statement of fact. "You read the book." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Every 7th summer," he continued, his voice as flat and empty as the plains outside, "the farm requires a new caretaker. The land gives, but it must also receive. It's the pact. It's the only way." Analyze, she understood. She tended the soil from below, and the farm survived the dust. "Now it's your turn." He revealed the final unspoken rule, the one that underpinned all the others. I was the offering. My well-paid summer job was nothing more than a lure, the fee for my life, funded by the farm's unnatural, blood-soaked bounty. Panic gave way to a cold, desperate clarity. They expected me to be a lamb for the slaughter, just like Annalise. But I wasn't a desperate girl from the 1930s. I was a student of systems, of logic, and their system, this pact, had rules. I realized, in a flash of adrenaline-fueled insight, that my only hope was to break the system by weaponizing those very rules. I had to create chaos. "It's time," Silas said, taking a step toward me. I didn't wait for him to take another. I bolted. I threw open the kitchen door and sprinted out into the yard, ignoring Elspeth's sharp cry. My first target was the root cellar. I wrenched open the bolted door and scrambled down the steps. I grabbed 2 of the dusty mason jars, the one with the teeth, the one with the blonde braid, and ran back into the sunlight. Silas was coming after me, his long legs eating up the ground. I ran towards the fields, directly violating Rule 1, as the sun was still high in the sky. As I reached the edge of the wheat, I took the metal watch from my wrist, the one I'd stopped wearing to comply with Rule 11, and hurled it as far as I could into the sea of gold. I heard a subtle shift in the air, a low hum, as if something's attention had been drawn by the glint of metal. Then I smashed the jars on the hard, packed earth of the yard, the dark liquid, and its gruesome contents splattered across the ground. I had wasted the offering. I had broken Rule 10. The reaction was instantaneous. A low groan seemed to rise from the soil itself. The ground beneath my feet trembled. The chase was on. I plunged into the disorienting maze of the tall wheat, the stalks whipping at my face. I could hear Silas behind me, crashing through the crop, cursing my name. But there was another sound now, a deep, rustling, dragging sound. The entity, enraged by the broken rules and the wasted tithe, was awake and no longer bound by the Gable's careful rituals. I burst out of the wheat field and scrambled down the dusty embankment of a dry creek bed, its banks thick with willows and sagebrush. I looked back just in time to see Silas stumble at the edge of the field. Dark root, like tendrils erupted from the soil, wrapping around his ankles. He gave a single, choked cry as he was dragged down into the earth, vanishing into the churning dirt as if into water. I didn't stop. I ran, following the wending path of the creek bed. I could hear Elspeth's voice, thin and reedy, calling my name from the top of the embankment. And then I heard another sound of frantic, deafening cawing. A black cloud of crows, hundreds of them, descended from the sky. They weren't just watching anymore. They swarmed Elspeth, a vortex of black feathers and sharp beaks. Her screams were lost in their cacophony. A dark perversion of Rule 7. I was alone. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs were numb, my only goal the distant gray ribbon of the gravel road, the symbolic boundary between this cursed world and my own. I finally collapsed onto the road, waving my arms frantically at an approaching plume of dust. A pickup truck screeched to a halt. The driver, a farmer with a kind, weathered face, looked at me with wide, concerned eyes. I had escaped. The aftermath was a blur of police stations and confused officers. They found the Gable farm abandoned. The house was already falling into a state of disrepair, the combine harvester sitting silent in a half-finished field. They found Annalise's diary, but dismissed it as a piece of macabre fiction, the product of a troubled, isolated mind. They found no bodies. My story was unbelievable, written off as a psychological break brought on by stress and isolation. Months passed. I was back in my small apartment in Regina, the prairie sun a distant memory. I was safe. I had survived. But the horror of a truly binding contract is that it doesn't end just because you walk away. One morning, I noticed a small terracotta pot on my windowsill. I didn't remember buying it. A single, dark green shoot was pushing its way up from the soil. Annoyed, I pulled it out and tossed it in the trash. The next day, it was back, taller and stronger. I started noticing other things. No matter how hard I scrubbed, there was always a fine line of dark, rich soil ingrained under my fingernails. My food, no matter what I cooked, had a faint, earthy aftertaste. The final, chilling realization came to me in the dead of night. I looked at my hands, at the dirt that would not leave, and I understood. I hadn't escaped the pact. By being the last one standing, the sole survivor of the farm's bloody ledger, I had inherited it. The land had claimed its caretaker. I didn't need to be on the farm anymore. The farm, and its silent, waiting hunger, was now in me. The rules had followed me home.